Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The hard problem of consciousness. Why brain activity does not explain experience. A neuroscientist maps every neuron in the visual cortex, traces every connection, measures every firing pattern, understands completely the physical processes that occur when someone sees the color red, knows which wavelengths of light activate which photoreceptors, which signals travel along which pathways, which brain regions respond, and the scientist can predict with perfect accuracy when someone will report seeing red, can manipulate brain states to produce the experience, has complete knowledge of the physical mechanisms. And yet philosopher David Chalmers asks a question that this knowledge does not answer. Why is there something it is like to see red? Why does the physical processing produce a subjective experience, a quale, a feeling of redness that exists from the inside, from the first-person perspective? And this question is the hard problem of consciousness, the problem of explaining why and how physical processes give rise to subjective experience, to phenomenal consciousness, to the felt quality of mental states. And Chalmers distinguishes this from the easy problems, which are merely difficult scientific questions about how the brain processes information, how it integrates data, how it produces behavior. And while these easy problems are challenging, they are tractable, are problems science can solve through normal methods. But the hard problem is different, is a question of a different kind. Asks not how consciousness functions, but why it exists at all. Why there is subjective experience accompanying physical processes rather than those processes occurring without any inner experience, without anything it is like to undergo them. Imagine a zombie, a philosophical zombie, a creature that is physically identical to a human being, molecule for molecule, neuron for neuron, that behaves exactly like a human, says the same things, acts the same ways, but has no inner experience, no consciousness, is dark inside. And Chalmers argues that such a zombie is conceivable, is logically possible. And if zombies are possible, then consciousness is not reducible to physical processes, because the zombie has all the physical processes but lacks consciousness. And so consciousness must be something additional, something over and above the physical. And this is why the hard problem is hard, because it seems to require explaining how something non-physical, something subjective, emerges from something physical, something objective. And no amount of knowledge about brain function, about neural mechanisms, about information processing, seems to bridge this gap, seems to explain why there is something it is like rather than nothing. Visualize the explanatory gap. On one side is all the physical information, all the facts about brain states and neural firing and chemical processes. And on the other side is subjective experience, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the taste of coffee. And the gap between these two sides seems unbridgeable. Seems like knowledge of one does not give knowledge of the other. And no matter how much we learn about brains, we do not seem to get closer to explaining why brains produce consciousness, why certain physical systems have inner lives. And this gap is what makes the hard problem hard, what makes consciousness seem mysterious, what makes it resist scientific explanation. The hard problem has generated multiple responses. Materialists who deny that there is a hard problem, who argue that consciousness is reducible to physical processes, that once we fully understand the brain, we will understand consciousness, that the appearance of a gap is due to our current ignorance, and dualists who accept the hard problem and argue that consciousness is non-physical, is a separate substance or property that exists alongside the physical, and Mysterians who accept the hard problem but argue that it is unsolvable, that human cognitive capacities are limited, that we may never understand how consciousness arises from physical processes because our minds are not equipped to grasp the answer. One materialist response appeals to functionalism, argues that consciousness is not a separate thing, but is identical to certain functional roles, certain patterns of information processing, and what it is like to see red is just the functional role that seeing red plays in the cognitive system, the way it affects memory and behavior and other mental states. And this functional role can be fully captured physically, can be explained in terms of brain processes, and so there is no explanatory gap, no hard problem, only a conceptual confusion that disappears once we realize that consciousness is function and function is physical. Another materialist response appeals to eliminativism, argues that our ordinary concepts of consciousness are confused, are based on folk psychology that science will replace. And when neuroscience matures, we will abandon talk of subjective experience, we'll recognize that what we called consciousness was really just neural processes misdescribed, and the hard problem will dissolve, because the phenomenon it concerns, subjective experience as we currently conceive it, does not exist, and this radical response rejects the starting point of the hard problem, rejects that there is anything subjective that needs explaining. Dualist responses accept that consciousness is irreducibly subjective, is not reducible to physical processes, and argue for property dualism, where consciousness is a non-physical property that physical systems can have, or substance dualism, where consciousness is a separate mental substance that interacts with the physical body. And these views face the interaction problem, the question of how non-physical consciousness can affect physical processes, how mental causation works, and dualists have proposed various answers, some appealing to fundamental psychophysical laws, others denying that consciousness has causal power, but none has achieved consensus. Mysterian responses associated with Colin McGinn accept that the hard problem is real, but argue that it is unsolvable by humans, that our cognitive architecture is not suited to understanding how consciousness arises from matter. Just as rats cannot understand quantum mechanics, humans cannot understand consciousness. And this is not a failure of science, but a limit of human cognition. And we should accept this limit, recognize that some questions are beyond us, and the hard problem is one of them. The hard problem also connects to the knowledge argument. To Mary, the colour scientist who knows all physical facts about colour but has never seen colour, and when she finally sees red for the first time, she learns something new, learns what red looks like, and this suggests that physical knowledge does not exhaust knowledge about consciousness, that there are facts about subjective experience that are not physical facts, and this supports the view that consciousness is not reducible to physical processes, that the hard problem is real. The neuroscientist continues mapping neurons, continues discovering mechanisms, and the scientific progress is real, is impressive, reveals extraordinary complexity in how brains process information. But the hard problem remains, the question of why this processing feels like anything, why there is an inner light, why we are not zombies, and Chalmers's challenge persists, unsolved, perhaps unsolvable, a permanent limit on scientific explanation, or perhaps a confusion that will dissolve with better understanding. And philosophers and scientists continue to debate, continue to propose theories, continue to argue about whether consciousness is physical or non-physical, reducible or irreducible, explicable or mysterious, and the hard problem endures as one of the central problems in philosophy of mind, a problem that touches on the nature of reality, on the relationship between mind and matter, on what we are and what it means to be conscious. And the problem remains hard, stubbornly resistant to solution, a gap that knowledge does not seem to close, an explanatory challenge that persists despite centuries of reflection and decades of neuroscience, and consciousness continues to feel mysterious, continues to seem like something that physics cannot capture, and the hard problem stands as a monument to this mystery, a permanent reminder that subjective experience, the felt quality of mental life, resists reduction to objective physical processes, and whether this resistance reflects a genuine metaphysical divide or merely our current conceptual limitations remains one of philosophy's deepest and most difficult questions. The knowledge argument, what the colour scientist learns when she leaves her room. A scientist named Mary spends her entire life in a black and white room, a room devoid of colour, where everything is shades of grey, and Mary is a brilliant neuroscientist who specialises in a colour vision, and she studies colour from this colourless room using black and white monitors and books. And she learns everything physical there is to know about colour, learns about wavelengths and photoreceptors and neural pathways, learns about opponent processing and colour constancy, knows exactly which brain states correspond to which colour experiences, can predict with perfect accuracy what someone will report when shown a coloured object. And Mary's knowledge of the physical facts about colour is complete, exhaustive, includes every fact that physics, chemistry, and neuroscience can provide. And yet Mary has never seen colour, has never experienced red or blue or yellow. And then one day, Mary leaves the room, steps outside, and sees a ripe tomato for the first time, and she experiences red. And philosopher Frank Jackson asks, does Mary learn something new? Does she gain new knowledge when she sees red for the first time? And the intuition is yes. She learns what red looks like, learns what it is like to experience red. And this new knowledge is not physical knowledge, because she already had all physical knowledge. And so there are facts about consciousness, facts about subjective experience that are not physical facts. And physicalism is false. And this is the knowledge argument, also called the Mary argument, one of the most influential arguments against physicalism, a challenge to the view that the physical facts exhaust all facts. Imagine Mary's situation, surrounded by books and papers explaining colour in physical terms. She knows that red light has wavelengths around 700 nanometers, knows that it activates long wavelength cones in the retina, knows the neural pathways from retina to visual cortex, knows which patterns of neural firing correspond to red experiences, and she can answer any questioner about the physics and neuroscience of colour, can predict how people will react to colours, what they will say, how their brains will respond. And yet when she sees red for the first time, she says, aha, so that is what red looks like. And this reaction suggests she learned something, gained knowledge she did not have before. And since she already knew all physical facts, the new knowledge must be non-physical, must be knowledge of phenomenal facts, of what experiences are like. And these phenomenal facts are not reducible to physical facts, are additional to them, and so physicalism is incomplete, fails to capture everything about consciousness. The knowledge argument can be formulated as follows. Mary knows all physical facts about colour vision before leaving the room. When Mary leaves the room and sees red, she learns something new. Therefore, there are facts about colour vision that are not physical facts. And this conclusion supports property dualism, supports the view that conscious experiences have phenomenal properties that are not physical properties, that the subjective character of experience is something over and above the objective physical facts. And the argument challenges physicalist theories of mind, challenges the claim that neuroscience can give complete knowledge of consciousness, suggests that first-person subjective experience involves aspects that third-person objective science cannot capture. Visualize the two kinds of knowledge. On one side is Mary's complete physical knowledge, all the objective facts about colour, the facts that can be stated in scientific language, measured by instruments, predicted by theories. And on the other side is phenomenal knowledge, knowledge of what red looks like, knowledge that can only be acquired through experience, through having the experience oneself. And the knowledge argument says these two kinds of knowledge are distinct, that no amount of the first kind can yield the second kind, and this distinctness shows that phenomenal facts are not physical facts, that consciousness has properties that resist physical reduction. Physicalists have developed multiple responses to the knowledge argument. The ability hypothesis argues that what Mary gains when she leaves the room is not new factual knowledge, but new abilities. The ability to recognize red, to imagine red, to remember red. And abilities are not facts, are know-how rather than know that. And so Mary's gain does not show that there are non-physical facts, only that physical knowledge does not automatically confer all abilities. And this response distinguishes knowing facts from having abilities, treats phenomenal knowledge as a kind of skill rather than propositional knowledge. The acquaintance hypothesis argues similarly that Mary gains acquaintance with red, becomes directly related to the experience of red in a way she was not before. But this acquaintance is not knowledge of new facts, it is a new way of knowing old facts, a new mode of presentation of facts she already knew. And so the knowledge argument fails because what Mary gains is not new knowledge, but new acquaintance. An acquaintance with experiences is compatible with physicalism does not show that there are non-physical facts. The old fact new guy's response argues that Mary learns no new fact but learns an old fact in a new way, learns about the physical property of experiencing red by having that experience, whereas before she only knew about it through descriptions and theories. And the same fact, the physical fact about red experiences, can be grasped in different ways, through theoretical knowledge or through direct experience, and Mary's situation involves gaining a new mode of access to old facts, not gaining access to new facts, and so the argument does not refute physicalism. Another response denies the key intuition, argues that Mary does not learn anything new when she leaves the room, that she already knew what red looks like from her complete physical knowledge. That complete physical knowledge includes phenomenal knowledge, and our intuition to the contrary is mistaken, is based on underestimating what complete physical knowledge would include. And if Mary truly knew everything physical about colour, then she would be able to deduce what red looks like, would already have phenomenal knowledge. And so the argument's premise is false. The knowledge argument also raises questions about the relationship between different kinds of knowledge, between theoretical and experiential knowledge, between objective and subjective perspectives, and whether these can be integrated, whether science can accommodate first-person phenomenal facts. And Jackson himself later rejected the knowledge argument, became a physicalist, argued that the knowledge Mary gains is not knowledge of new facts but is compatible with physicalism, though other philosophers continue to defend the argument, continue to insist that Mary's gain shows the incompleteness of physical accounts of consciousness. Mary sits in her black and white room, learning about colour, mastering every physical fact, and then she steps outside, and the world bursts into colour, and she sees red for the first time, and the tomato glows in the sunlight, and her reaction is wonder, is discovery, is the sense of learning something utterly new, and whether this reaction reveals that physicalism is false, that consciousness includes non-physical properties, or whether it merely shows that knowledge comes in different forms, different modes, remains disputed, remains one of the central debates in philosophy of mind, and the knowledge argument persists, powerful and controversial, a challenge to physicalist theories, a defense of the irreducibility of phenomenal consciousness, and a reminder that subjective experience, the what-it-is likeness of mental states, resists capture in purely objective physical terms, and Mary's story continues to be told, to be analysed, to be debated, and the question remains, did she learn something new, something that physical knowledge could not provide? And the answer determines whether consciousness can be fully explained by neuroscience, or whether phenomenal experience involves something more, something that transcends the physical. And the knowledge argument endures as a vivid illustration of the explanatory gap, the gap between physical facts and phenomenal facts, between brain and mind, between what we can know objectively and what we can only know by experience. The inverted spectrum problem. What if your red looks like my blue? Two people stand before a ripe tomato, and both say the tomato is red. Both use the word correctly. Both learned colour terms in the same way, by being shown red objects and hearing the word red. And their colour vision is normal. Their eyes and brains function identically. And yet the question arises, do they see the same colour? Does the tomato produce the same subjective experience in both? Or could it be that what one person experiences as red, the other experiences as blue? That their colour experiences are inverted, their spectrums reversed, and yet because they learned language the same way, because red things produce the same relative patterns, they both call the same things red, and have no way of discovering that their experiences differ. And this is the inverted spectrum problem, a thought experiment that has troubled philosophers since Locke, a puzzle about whether subjective experiences are private, whether they could differ between people in ways that behavioural and physical evidence cannot detect, and whether such differences would matter, whether they would mean anything if they are undetectable in principle. Imagine spectrum inversion more precisely. Person A sees red things as having the experience that person B has when seeing blue things, and person A sees blue things as having the experience person B has when seeing red, and this inversion is systematic, extends across the entire spectrum. Green is inverted with purple, orange with indigo, and so on. And both people learned colour words by associating them with the experiences they actually have. So person A learned to call things red that produce the blue experience, and person B learned to call things red that produce the red experience, and their language use is identical, their behaviour indistinguishable, and the inversion is undetectable from the outside, cannot be discovered through any behavioural test, through any physical measurement, through any scientific investigation, because all the objective facts are the same, only the subjective experiences differ. The inverted spectrum problem raises questions about the privacy of qualia, about whether subjective experiences are essentially first personal, accessible only to the person having them, and if spectrum inversion is possible, then qualia are private, are not reducible to anything public or objective, because two people with inverted spectrums have different qualia despite having identical physical states and identical behaviours. And this challenges functionalism, challenges the view that mental states are defined by their functional roles, by their patterns of causes and effects, because inverted spectrums have the same functional roles, but different experiential qualities, and so functional role does not determine qualia, does not exhaust the nature of conscious experience. Visualize the problem as a question about the relationship between physical processes and subjective experience. The same physical processes, the same wavelengths of light, the same retinal responses, the same neural firings produce different experiences in inverted people, red experience versus blue experience. And this suggests that experience is not determined by physical processes alone, that there is something additional, something that could vary even when physical processes are fixed. And this something is what philosophers call qualia, the intrinsic experiential qualities of mental states. The what, it is likeness, and the inverted spectrum problem shows, or claims to show, that qualia are real, are distinct from physical and functional properties, are private and subjective. One response to the inverted spectrum problem denies that spectrum inversion is possible, argues that colour experiences are tied to their functional roles, to how they affect behaviour and other mental states, and systematic inversion would require inverting all these connections, would require changing not just colour experiences, but all the associations and reactions and emotions connected to colours. And once all these changes are made, the supposedly inverted person no longer has genuinely inverted experiences, but has the same experiences in a different functional network. And genuine inversion, preserving all functional roles while changing only qualia, is impossible, is incoherent, and the thought experiment fails because it describes an impossible scenario. Another response accepts that spectrum inversion is possible, but argues that it does not threaten functionalism or physicalism, because if inversion is undetectable in principle, then it is not a real difference, not a difference that matters, and science is concerned with objective differences, with differences that make a difference to behaviour or physical processes, and subjective differences that have no objective manifestation are not the kind of things science needs to explain, are not part of the natural world that science investigates. And so the inverted spectrum problem, even if it shows that qualia are private, does not show that they are non-physical, only that they are aspects of physical states that science does not need to characterize in its theories. A third response appeals to the ecological theory of perception, argues that colour experiences are not arbitrary inner states, but are shaped by the environment, by what colours signify, by their natural and biological meanings, and red looks the way it does because of its associations with blood, fire, ripe fruit, danger, and these associations are grounded in evolutionary history, in universal human experiences, and systematic inversion would disrupt these associations, would make red look restful and blue look alarming, and this would be detectable, would affect behaviour, and so genuine spectrum inversion, preserving all functional roles, including emotional and associative roles, is impossible. The inverted spectrum problem also connects to the problem of other minds, because if spectrum inversion is possible, then we cannot know what other people experience, cannot know whether their red is our red or our blue, and this creates a kind of skepticism, a recognition that subjective experience is essentially private, is not fully accessible to others, and while we can know what people say about their experiences, what behaviours they exhibit, we cannot know what they actually feel, what their experiences are like from the inside, and this privacy is both troubling and profound, suggests that each person's consciousness is a private world, knowable fully only to themselves. Some philosophers argue that the inverted spectrum problem trades on confusion about the nature of colour experience, that colours are not simple intrinsic qualities, but are defined by their relationships to other colours, to contexts, to perceptual constancies, and that inverting these relationships is not coherent, not a genuine possibility, and that the thought experiment misleads us by treating colours as if they were simple atoms of experience that could be swapped without affecting anything else, when in fact colour experience is holistic, is embedded in networks of perception and cognition, and cannot be varied independently. Others embrace the inverted spectrum problem, argue that it reveals important truths about consciousness, that qualia are real, are private, are not reducible to functional or physical properties, and that any theory of consciousness must accommodate this, must allow for the possibility that physically and functionally identical beings could differ in their subjective experiences, and this supports property dualism, supports the view that phenomenal properties are additional to physical properties, are aspects of reality that physical science cannot capture. The two people stand before the tomato, both calling it red, and the question lingers, do they see the same thing? Do their experiences match? Or does one see what the other would call blue? And there is no way to tell, no test that reveals the truth, and the privacy of experience persists. The possibility that our inner worlds differ in ways we cannot communicate, in ways language cannot capture, and the inverted spectrum problem remains, not solved, not refuted, not accepted, but persistent as a challenge to theories of mind, as a thought experiment that probes the nature of subjective experience, as a question about whether qualia are private, whether consciousness has aspects that resist objective description, and whether the inner life of another person is truly accessible or forever hidden behind the veil of their behaviour and their words, and the tomato remains red, called red by both, but whether they see the same red, whether their experiences converge or diverge behind the labels, remains uncertain. remains one of the enduring mysteries about the nature of consciousness and the privacy of subjective experience. The manipulation argument, when being programmed feels like choosing. A scientist creates a person in a laboratory, designs their brain molecule by molecule, programs their psychology precisely, installs specific beliefs, desires, values, personality traits, and then releases this person into the world, and the person deliberates about what to do, weighs options, considers consequences, makes decisions based on their reasons, their desires, their values, and all of this psychological processing feels normal from the inside, feels like genuine deliberation, genuine choice, and yet the person's entire psychology was determined by the scientist, was programmed, and so the person's choices are not really their own, not really free, are the scientist's choices implemented through the person's brain, and the person is not responsible for actions that flow from programmed psychology, is more like a puppet than an agent. And this is the manipulation argument against compatibilism. The argument that being determined by natural causes, by genes and environment, is relevantly similar to being determined by manipulation, by programming. And if programmed persons lack free will, then naturally determined persons also lack free will. And since determinism says all persons are naturally determined, all persons lack free will if determinism is true, and compatibilism is false. And this manipulation argument, developed by Dirk Pereboom and others, creates a serious challenge for compatibilist theories. Forces compatibilists to explain how natural determination differs from manipulation, how being caused by evolution and upbringing differs from being caused by a neuroscientist. And the argument remains controversial, remains debated, and compatibilists offer various responses. But the challenge persists. Imagine the manipulated person situation. They wake up in the laboratory, memories implanted, personality formed, and they go about their life, make choices, pursue goals, and from their perspective, everything seems normal. They feel like they are choosing freely, feel like their decisions are their own, and yet every thought, every desire, every value was installed by the scientist. And nothing about their psychology is random. Nothing escaped the scientist's control. And now consider whether this person is morally responsible for their actions, whether they deserve praise or blame. And the intuition is no. They are not responsible because their actions flow from programmed psychology, from values and desires they did not choose, that were imposed on them. And responsibility requires that psychology be one's own, not be externally determined. And the manipulated person's psychology is not their own, is the scientist's creation. And so they lack responsibility, lack free will. The manipulation argument proceeds through cases, starts with extreme manipulation, obvious programming, and then gradually moves toward more natural cases, and asks at each stage whether the person is responsible, and the cases are designed to show that there is no relevant difference between manipulation and natural causation, that if manipulation undermines responsibility, then natural determination also undermines responsibility. And the four-case argument, Pereboom's version, goes as follows. In case 1, a person is directly manipulated by scientists who induce specific mental states. In case 2, a person is programmed from birth by scientists who arrange their environment and training. In case 3, a person is determined by their genetic inheritance and upbringing without any intentional manipulation. In case 4, a person is determined by the normal causal processes of a deterministic universe. And Pereboom argues that there is no morally relevant difference between these cases, that if case 1 undermines responsibility, then so do the others. And since case 4 is just determinism, determinism undermines responsibility, and compatibilism is false. Visualize the progression, from direct neural manipulation to genetic engineering to natural upbringing to deterministic causation. And at each stage, the person's psychology is caused by factors beyond their control, factors they did not choose. And the manipulation argument says that The source of causation, whether intentional or natural, does not matter for responsibility. What matters is that the person's psychology was determined by factors beyond their control, and this determination undermines freedom regardless of whether a scientist or nature did the determining. And if we agree that the manipulated person, in case one is not responsible, then we must agree that naturally determined persons, in case 4 are also not responsible, and compatibilism, which says determinism is compatible with responsibility, is refuted. Compatibilists respond to the manipulation argument with various strategies. One response distinguishes between manipulation and natural determination, argues that manipulation involves bypassing the person's normal, deliberative processes, involves imposing psychology externally, while natural determination involves the person's psychology developing through normal processes, through learning and experience and interaction with the world. And this difference matters for responsibility, makes naturally determined persons responsible, even though manipulated persons are not. And the manipulation argument fails because it ignores this difference, treats all determination as equivalent when it is not. Another compatibilist response argues that the manipulated person is responsible, challenges the intuition that manipulation undermines responsibility. And this response requires biting the bullet, accepting that even persons whose psychology was programmed by scientists are responsible as long as their actions flow from their own deliberation, their own reasons, even if those reasons were installed. And this response preserves compatibilism by denying that manipulation undermines responsibility, by insisting that what matters for responsibility is not the origin of psychology, but its current functional organization. And if the person deliberates and acts on their deliberations, then they are responsible, regardless of how their psychology came to be. A third compatibilist response distinguishes between historical and structural accounts of responsibility, argues that responsibility depends on the structure of the person's psychology, on whether they have the right kind of control mechanisms, the right kind of reflective capacities, not on the history of how that psychology was formed and manipulated. Persons can have the right structure, even if their history is abnormal, and so they are responsible. And the manipulation argument fails because it assumes that history matters when only structure matters, and compatibilism is preserved by adopting a structural rather than historical account of responsibility. Incompatibilists defend the manipulation argument, defend the intuition that manipulation undermines responsibility, and argue that compatibilist responses are ad hoc, are motivated by a desire to save compatibilism rather than by principled distinctions, and there is no relevant difference between being determined by a scientist and being determined by genes and environment. Both involve the person's psychology being shaped by factors beyond their control. Both undermine the kind of control required for responsibility, and the manipulation argument succeeds in showing that compatibilism is false, that determination, whether by manipulation or by nature, is inconsistent with freedom. The manipulation argument also raises questions about what responsibility requires, about whether responsibility is historical, depends on how psychology was formed, or structural, depends only on current organization. And this debate is central to understanding free will, to clarifying what kind of control is required for moral responsibility. And the manipulation argument forces this debate into the open, makes it explicit. And even if the argument does not definitively refute compatibilism, it succeeds in challenging compatibilists to articulate their view clearly, to explain what distinguishes responsible from non-responsible agents. The programmed person walks through life, choosing, deliberating, acting, and feeling free. And the question remains whether they are genuinely responsible, whether their choices are truly their own, or whether they are puppets, implementations of the scientist's design. And the manipulation argument uses this person to challenge compatibilism, to question whether natural determination is really different from artificial manipulation, and the argument persists as one of the most powerful challenges to compatibilist theories. A challenge that highlights the difference between feeling free and being free, between subjective experience of choice and objective reality of determination. And the manipulated person remains choosing but programmed, free feeling but determined. And whether such a person is responsible remains contested. And the manipulation argument endures as a permanent challenge to compatibilism, forcing recognition that if determinism is true, then we are all in a sense manipulated, determined by factors beyond our control. And whether this determination undermines responsibility, whether it makes us unfree, remains one of the deepest questions in philosophy of free will. The non-identity problem. Why creating a disabled child seems wrong but harms no one. A woman takes medication that she knows will cause her future child to be born with a disability that will significantly reduce the child's quality of life, but will not make life so bad that it is not worth living, and the child will live with chronic pain, with limited mobility, with challenges that most people do not face. But the child will still experience joy and love and meaning, and life will be worth living overall, just harder, just less good than it could have been. And we are inclined to say that the woman did something wrong, that she should have stopped taking the medication, should have waited until it cleared her system before conceiving. And if she had waited, she would have conceived a different child, a healthy child. And this seems like the obviously right choice, but now philosopher Derek Parfit poses a troubling question. Who exactly was harmed by the woman's choice? Who was made worse off? And the answer is puzzling because the disabled child cannot claim to have been harmed. Because if the woman had waited and conceived a different child, then this particular child would not exist at all, and the disabled child's only alternative to existing with a disability is not existing. And existing with a disability, as long as life is worth living, is better than not existing. And so the disabled child is not worse off, is actually better off for existing. And if no one was harmed, then how can the action be wrong? And this is the non-identity problem, a puzzle about how to ground judgments of wrongness in cases where the identity of affected individuals depends on the choices being evaluated. Imagine the scenario more carefully. At time 1, the woman is taking medication, and she has a choice: conceive now and have a disabled child, or wait a month, stop the medication, and conceive a healthy child. And suppose she chooses to conceive now, and 9 months later, a child is born with a disability. Call this child Alex, and Alex grows up facing challenges, but also experiencing good things. And on balance, Alex is glad to be alive, prefers existing to not existing. And now we ask whether the woman wronged Alex, whether Alex was harmed by the woman's choice. And the problem is that the alternative was not Alex without the disability. The alternative was a different child entirely, because different sperm and egg would have united if the woman had waited, and different genetic material produces a different person. And so Alex's options were either exist with the disability or not exist at all. And Alex is better off existing with the disability than not existing. And so how can Alex complain? How can Alex say the woman wronged them, when the only other possibility is non-existence? And if Alex cannot complain, then who can? And if no one can complain, then in what sense was the action wrong? The problem generalizes beyond this specific case. It arises whenever a choice affects who will exist rather than merely affecting how existing people will fare. And these cases are called non-identity cases, and they include decisions about environmental policy, where current generations choose between policies that affect which future people will exist. Decisions about genetic engineering, where parents choose traits for children who would not exist without that choice. Decisions about timing of reproduction, where different times lead to different children. And in all these cases, the people affected by the choice cannot claim they would have been better off if a different choice had been made, because they would not have existed if a different choice had been made. And so, Standard harm-based reasoning seems to fail, seems unable to explain why these choices might be wrong. Visualize the problem as a branching tree. At the decision point, 2 branches extend. On one branch, a child with disability exists. On the other branch, a different healthy child exists. And we compare the 2 branches and say the second is better, produces a better outcome, a healthier child, less suffering, more well-being. But when we try to say who benefits from choosing the second branch, we cannot point to anyone. The disabled child does not benefit because that child does not exist in the second branch. The healthy child does not benefit because that child does not exist in the first branch. And so there is no person who is made better off by choosing the better branch. And this seems to undermine the claim that the better outcome is better for anyone. And yet we strongly feel that the choice matters, that creating a child with avoidable disability is wrong. Parfit proposed the non-identity problem as a challenge to person-affecting principles. Principles that say an action is wrong only if it makes someone worse off. And these principles work well for ordinary cases where the same people exist regardless of the choice, but they fail for non-identity cases where different choices lead to different people existing. And if we want to maintain that choices in non-identity cases can be wrong, we must adopt impersonal principles, principles that evaluate outcomes based on total or average well-being, or some other measure that does not depend on comparing how well-off particular individuals are across different choices. But impersonal principles face their own difficulties. They can imply things like the repugnant conclusion. They can recommend creating vast populations with minimal welfare, and they can conflict with intuitions about person-relative reasons and obligations. One response to the non-identity problem is to reject the claim that wrongness requires harming someone, to argue that some actions are wrong, even though they do not make anyone worse off, and creating a child with an avoidable disability is wrong. Not because it harms the child, but because it fails to give the child the best start in life, violates a duty to create the best children we can, and this response requires specifying what duties we have regarding procreation, what standards of care apply to potential children, and whether these duties are owed to specific individuals or are impersonal obligations about making the world better. Another response is to argue that the disabled child is harmed after all, harmed relative to an appropriate baseline, and the baseline is not non-existence, but rather the life the child could have had if different choices had been made, even though those choices would have resulted in a different child. We can still say that creating a child with avoidable disability is wrong because it brings into existence someone whose life contains avoidable suffering. And this suffering is bad even if it does not make anyone worse off compared to any alternative where that same person exists. And this response requires defending an impersonal notion of harm. Harm that is not comparative, not based on counterfactuals about specific individuals, but based on the presence of bad states like suffering. A third response is to bite the bullet and accept that the action is not wrong, that if no one is harmed, then nothing bad has happened. And this response embraces person-affecting principles and accepts their implications even in non-identity cases, admits that we cannot say the woman wronged the disabled child, cannot say she should have waited, and while this seems counterintuitive, perhaps our intuitions are wrong, perhaps we are confused about non-identity cases, and the theoretical clarity of person-affecting principles outweighs the cost of accepting counterintuitive conclusions. The non-identity problem has practical implications for reproductive ethics, for decisions about genetic screening, prenatal testing, selective abortion, and genetic modification, because many of these decisions are non-identity cases where choosing one option means one child exists, and choosing another means a different child exists. And if we cannot say these choices harm anyone, then it becomes difficult to regulate them. Difficult to say parents have obligations about which children to create. And yet most people feel strongly that some procreative choices are wrong. that parents should not knowingly create children with serious avoidable disabilities, that we have reasons to prefer healthy children, and these feelings need grounding, need principles that explain why these choices matter, even though no particular person is made worse off. The woman stands at the choice point, medication in hand, and she can conceive now or wait, can create a child with disability or create a different healthy child, and the choice seems obvious. And yet when we try to justify the obvious answer, try to explain why waiting is better, the justification becomes elusive, slips through our fingers, because no one is harmed by conceiving now. The child who exists is glad to exist, and the child who would exist if she waited does not exist to be disappointed. And the non-identity problem reveals a gap in our moral thinking, a case where our judgments are clear, but our reasons are unclear, where standard moral frameworks fail to explain intuitions we hold strongly, and Parfit's problem remains unsolved, challenging, forcing recognition that identity matters, that who exists matters, and that moral philosophy has not yet developed adequate tools for handling cases where choices determine who exists rather than merely how well existing people fare, and the problem persists, technical and troubling, a reminder that even procreation, the most basic of human activities, raises profound ethical puzzles that resist easy answers. The omnipotence paradox. Can God create a rock so heavy that God cannot lift it? A theologian proclaims that God is omnipotent, all-powerful, able to do anything, and this claim is central to many religious traditions. Reflects the idea that God is unlimited, unconstrained, the ultimate being with ultimate power, and yet a simple question reveals a logical puzzle, a challenge to the coherence of omnipotence. And the question asks whether God can create a rock so heavy that God cannot lift it. And this question seems innocent, but it creates a dilemma. Because if God can create such a rock, then there is something God cannot do, namely, lift the rock. And so God is not omnipotent. And if God cannot create such a rock, then again, there is something God cannot do, namely, create the unliftable rock. And so again, God is not omnipotent. And either way, omnipotence seems impossible, seems self-contradictory, and this is the omnipotence paradox, also called the stone paradox, a puzzle that has troubled theologians and philosophers for centuries, forcing them to clarify what omnipotence means, what powers an all-powerful being could and could not have, and whether the concept of omnipotence is even coherent. Imagine the scenario concretely. God stands in a cosmic workshop, materials at hand, ready to create, and God decides to make a rock, but not just any rock, a rock so massive, so heavy, so immovable that even God's infinite power cannot lift it, and God sets to work, shaping matter, compressing mass, until the rock is complete, and then God tries to lift it, and the rock does not budge. God pulls and pushes and exerts all divine force, but the rock remains on the ground, unliftable. And this seems to show that God is not omnipotent, because there is something God cannot do, cannot lift this particular rock. And yet if God never creates the rock, if God admits that creating such a rock is impossible, then this also shows God is not omnipotent, because there is something God cannot create. And the paradox presents a forced choice. Neither option preserves omnipotence, and the concept seems to collapse under its own logic. The paradox can be generalized beyond rocks. The question could be whether God can create a task so difficult that God cannot complete it, whether God can create a being so powerful that God cannot control it, whether God can make a rule so binding that God cannot break it, and in each case the same structure emerges. Either God can create the limiting thing, in which case God is limited by it, or God cannot create it, in which case God is limited by the inability to create it. And either way, God's power has boundaries, and omnipotence seems impossible. And this suggests that omnipotence might be an incoherent concept, might not be logically possible, might be like a square circle or a married bachelor, something that sounds meaningful but actually combines contradictory ideas and cannot exist. Theologians and philosophers have developed several responses to the paradox, attempting to show that omnipotence is coherent and that the paradox rests on misunderstandings or ambiguities. One common response is to restrict omnipotence to logically possible tasks, to say that God can do anything that is logically possible but cannot do things that are logically impossible, and creating a rock that an omnipotent being cannot lift is logically impossible, is self-contradictory, because omnipotence includes the ability to lift anything, and so a rock that cannot be lifted by an omnipotent being is a logical impossibility like a square circle. And God's inability to create logical impossibilities does not limit God's power in any meaningful sense, because logical impossibilities are not real tasks, are not things that could be done. And so excluding them from the scope of omnipotence is not a limitation but a clarification. Visualize omnipotence as a set of powers: the power to create anything logically possible, the power to know anything knowable, the power to do anything doable. And the set does not include impossible things, does not include making square circles or creating married bachelors or lifting unliftable rocks. Because these are not tasks, are not possibilities, are just combinations of words that do not refer to any coherent state of affairs. And just as we do not think a mathematician is limited because they cannot prove that 2 + 2 = 5, we should not think God is limited because God cannot do logically impossible things, because these are not things, are not genuine constraints on power. Another response distinguishes between God's essential attributes and God's contingent choices, and argues that omnipotence means God has the power to do anything consistent with God's nature. And part of God's nature is being omnipotent, and so God cannot create a situation where God lacks omnipotence, because that would contradict God's nature. But this is not a limitation on God's power. It is a feature of what God is. And just as God cannot make God not exist, because God is a necessary being, God cannot make God not omnipotent, because omnipotence is essential to God. And the rock scenario asks God to create a contradiction, to remain omnipotent while becoming not omnipotent, and this is incoherent. And God's inability to do it reflects logical necessity, not weakness. A third response embraces the paradox and argues that it shows omnipotence is paradoxical, is not a coherent concept, and rather than defending omnipotence, we should acknowledge that God's power, while immense, is not literally unlimited, that there are things God cannot do, and this is not a defect in God but a recognition that power, like any concept, has logical limits. And some religious traditions, particularly in Eastern philosophy, are comfortable with divine paradoxes, with the idea that ultimate reality transcends logical categories, and the paradox of omnipotence is just one of many paradoxes that arise when finite human concepts are applied to the infinite divine. The paradox also appears in discussions of free will and divine foreknowledge, because if God knows the future infallibly, then God knows what choices humans will make. And if God knows what choices humans will make, then humans cannot choose otherwise, because if they could, then God's knowledge would be wrong. And so divine omniscience seems to eliminate human free will. And this creates a dilemma similar to the omnipotence paradox. Either God is not omniscient, does not know future free choices, or humans are not free, do not have genuine choice. And both options are unpalatable to many theologians who want to preserve both divine perfection and human freedom. And various solutions have been proposed, involving timeless knowledge, middle knowledge, open theism, but none has won universal acceptance, and the tension remains. The omnipotence paradox reveals that the concept of unlimited power is more complex than it first appears, that power operates within logical and conceptual constraints, and that saying God is all-powerful does not mean God can do literally anything we can describe in words, but only that God can do anything that is genuinely possible, anything that makes sense, and the paradox serves as a test case forces clarification of what omnipotence means, pushes theologians to be precise about divine attributes, and shows that even the most basic theological claims require careful, philosophical analysis to be made coherent. God stands before the rock, or does not create the rock, and the paradox hangs in the air, a logical puzzle about power and limits, about possibility and coherence, and the answer depends on how omnipotence is defined, on whether logical impossibilities are excluded, on whether God's nature places constraints on divine action, and different traditions answer differently. Some saying God transcends logic, some saying logic constrains even God, and the omnipotence paradox remains, not fully resolved, still debated, still used to challenge and clarify theological concepts, and the rock sits there, hypothetical and impossible, a monument to the difficulties of thinking clearly about ultimate power, about infinite abilities, about what it means to say God can do anything. And the paradox persists, elegant and troubling, a reminder that even divine attributes, even the powers of an unlimited being, must answer to logic, must cohere, must make sense, and that the concept of omnipotence, for all its simplicity, conceals depths and difficulties that philosophy continues to explore. The lottery paradox. Imagine a fair lottery with 1 million tickets, and exactly one ticket will win, and you have not yet learned which ticket won. And now consider each individual ticket. Ticket number 1 has a 1 in a million chance of winning, which means it has a 999,999 in a million chance of losing. And this is overwhelmingly probable, so probable that it seems rational to believe that ticket 1 will not win. And the same reasoning applies to ticket 2, ticket 3, and every other ticket. Each has a minuscule chance of winning and an enormous chance of losing, and so it seems rational to believe of each ticket that it will not win. But now a problem emerges. If you believe that ticket 1 will not win, and you believe that ticket 2 will not win, and you believe this for each of the million tickets, then it seems you should believe that no ticket will win, because belief is generally thought to be closed under conjunction. If you believe P and you believe Q, then you should believe P and Q. And by repeated application of this principle, if you believe of each ticket that it will not win, then you should believe that none of them will win. But you also know with certainty that exactly one ticket will win. This is a stipulated fact of the lottery, and so you believe both that no ticket will win and that some ticket will win. And these beliefs are contradictory, and so you hold contradictory beliefs, which seems paradigmatically irrational. Yet each individual belief, the belief that ticket 1 will not win, the belief that ticket 2 will not win, and so on, seems perfectly rational, justified by the overwhelming probability. And so the lottery paradox forces a choice between accepting that rational belief can be inconsistent, rejecting closure of belief under conjunction, or denying that high probability is sufficient for rational belief. The paradox was articulated by Henry Kaiberg in the 1960s, and it has generated an enormous literature in epistemology with various proposed solutions and no clear consensus. And the paradox reveals deep tensions in our ordinary thinking about belief, knowledge, probability, and rationality. Tensions that cannot be easily resolved without giving up some cherished principles or intuitions. One response is to reject closure, to argue that rational belief is not closed under conjunction, that you can rationally believe each of many propositions without rationally believing all of them together, especially when the propositions are probabilistic and the number of them is large. And this response aligns with the observation that the probability of a conjunction is the product of the probabilities of the conjuncts. And so even if each ticket has only a 1 in a million chance of winning, the probability that at least one ticket wins is certainty. And so there is a gap between the high probability of each individual proposition and the low probability of their conjunction. And this gap justifies believing each individual proposition while not believing their conjunction. Another response is to raise the threshold for rational belief, to argue that high probability is not sufficient for belief, that belief requires something stronger, perhaps near certainty or probability, above some higher threshold, like 99% or 99.9%. And if we raise the threshold high enough, then it will no longer be rational to believe of each ticket that it will not win, because the probability that it will not win, while high, is not high enough to meet the raised threshold. And so the paradox dissolves, because the initial premise that it is rational to believe of each ticket that it will not win is rejected. A third response distinguishes between degrees of belief or credence and full belief, arguing that we should assign high credence to the proposition that ticket 1 will not win, perhaps 99.9999%, but we should not fully believe it. And full belief is reserved for propositions that meet a higher standard, perhaps certainty or near certainty. And this response preserves the intuition that high probability matters for rationality, while avoiding the paradox by denying that high probability justifies full belief. Still another response embraces a kind of rational inconsistency, arguing that in certain situations it is rational to hold inconsistent beliefs, that consistency is not an absolute requirement of rationality, that the world is complex and uncertain, and our beliefs must reflect that uncertainty, even if it means tolerating some inconsistency. And this response aligns with the preface paradox, where an author rationally believes each claim in a book while rationally believing that not. All the claims are true, and both paradoxes suggest that closure of belief under conjunction is too strong a requirement, that it demands a kind of logical perfection that finite agents in uncertain environments cannot achieve. The lottery paradox also connects to debates about the nature of knowledge, because it seems clear that you do not know that ticket 1 will not win, even though you have excellent evidence for believing it. And this suggests that knowledge requires something more than justified true belief, perhaps a safety condition, the requirement that in nearby possible worlds where you believe PP is true, and in the lottery case there are nearby worlds where the lottery is run fairly and ticket 1 wins, in which your belief that ticket 1 will not win is false, and so your belief fails the safety condition and does not constitute knowledge, even if it happens to be true. The paradox has practical implications as well, because we constantly make decisions based on beliefs that have high but not maximal probability. We believe that the plane will not crash, that the medicine will work, that the bridge will not collapse, and in each case there is a small probability that our belief is false. Yet we act on these beliefs. We board the plane, take the medicine, cross the bridge, and if we refuse to believe or act on anything less than certainty, we would be paralyzed, unable to function in a world of uncertainty. And so, the lottery paradox is not merely an abstract puzzle, but a reflection of the epistemic situation we constantly face, the need to navigate between skepticism and credulity, between demanding too much certainty and accepting too little, between the logical ideal of perfect consistency and the practical necessity of acting on incomplete information. The million tickets sit in the urn, one will win, the others will lose, and reason seems to say both that we should believe of each that it will lose, and that we should not believe that all will lose. And this contradiction, or apparent contradiction, has no easy resolution, no solution that preserves all intuitions and principles. And so the paradox remains a permanent challenge to theories of rational belief, a puzzle that forces philosophers to clarify what they mean by belief, by rationality, by justification, and to acknowledge that our ordinary concepts, when pressed to their limits, reveal inconsistencies and tensions that may be ineliminable features of finite cognition rather than problems to be solved. And the lottery continues, the tickets are drawn, one wins, the others lose, and we believe what we must believe, what rationality seems to demand, even when those beliefs, taken together, lead to contradiction. And the paradox endures, a monument to the gap between logical perfection and epistemic reality, between what we ought to believe in principle and what we must believe in practice. the ladder paradox, how moving objects shrink and fit where they shouldn't. A ladder 10 meters long rushes toward a garage that is only 8 meters deep. The garage has a front door and a back door, both initially open, and the ladder is traveling at a significant fraction of the speed of light, fast enough that length contraction becomes important. And according to special relativity objects moving at high speed contract along their direction of motion, and an observer standing in the garage watching the ladder approach calculates that at 80% of light speed, the ladder contracts to 6 meters, shorter than the garage, and so the observer plans to trap the ladder inside by simultaneously closing both doors for a brief moment, catching the entire contracted ladder inside the 8-meter garage. And this seems straightforward. The moving ladder fits because it is contracted, but now consider the perspective of someone riding on the ladder. In their reference frame, the ladder is at rest and maintains its full 10-meter length, while the garage is moving toward them at 80% of light speed, and so the garage contracts to less than 5 meters deep, far too small to contain the 10-meter ladder, and the person on the ladder knows that the front of the ladder will exit the back door before the back of the ladder enters the front door, and trapping the ladder inside is impossible, and so the two observers disagree about whether the ladder fits inside the garage, whether both doors can be closed simultaneously with the ladder inside. And this is the ladder paradox, also called the barn pole paradox, a puzzle about how length contraction and simultaneity interact in special relativity. The resolution lies in understanding that simultaneity is relative, that events which are simultaneous in one reference frame are not simultaneous in another, and the garage observer sees both doors closing at the same time, trapping the ladder, but the ladder observer sees the doors closing at different times. The front door closes first, then the back door closes later, and in the ladder frame, the sequence of events is as follows. The front of the ladder, still 10 meters away from the back of the ladder, enters the contracted garage and immediately exits the back door. And only after the entire ladder has passed through the garage does the back door close, followed by the front door closing. And so in the ladder frame, the ladder never fits entirely inside the garage. It is always longer than the garage, but the doors are never closed simultaneously with the ladder inside, and this removes the contradiction. Both observers agree on the physical facts. They agree on when collisions occur, on whether the ladder gets scratched or damaged, but they disagree about which events are simultaneous, about the order in which certain events happen. And this disagreement is not a matter of illusion or observation delay, but a fundamental feature of space-time in special relativity. Imagine space-time diagrams for both perspectives. In the garage frame, the diagram shows the two doors as vertical lines fixed in position, and the ladder as a diagonal streak moving horizontally through space and vertically through time. And the ladder is shortened by length contraction. And there is a moment when the back of the ladder has entered the front door and the front of the ladder has not yet exited the back door. And at this moment, both doors can be closed simultaneously, trapping the contracted ladder. And in the ladder frame, the diagram shows the ladder as two vertical lines, the front and back of the ladder stationary, and the garage as a moving object, contracted along the direction of motion. And the two doors close at different times. First, the front door closes and then opens, allowing the front of the ladder to pass. And then the back door closes after the back of the ladder has already entered. And the doors are never simultaneously closed around the ladder, and both descriptions are correct. Both are consistent with the laws of physics, and the apparent contradiction arises only from expecting that simultaneous in one frame means simultaneous in all frames. And relativity denies this. Simultaneity is frame dependent. The paradox also highlights the role of signals and information, because if the closing of the doors is controlled by signals sent at the speed of light, then the relativity of simultaneity ensures that the signals arrive at different times in different frames, and the physical mechanism that closes the doors respects causality and relativity, and no contradiction arises. The doors can be set to close when the ladder is inside, as measured in the garage frame, and this same mechanism, viewed from the ladder frame, closes the doors at different times, and the ladder is never trapped because it never fits entirely inside, and both descriptions are correct and consistent. Some people find this resolution unsatisfying. It seems like the ladder either fits or does not fit. There should be an objective fact of the matter, but relativity says that fits inside is not an objective notion. When motion is involved, it depends on what simultaneity convention is used, on which reference frame is chosen, and different frames can disagree about spatial relationships without any frame being wrong. And this is one of the deepest lessons of relativity, that spatial and temporal relationships are frame dependent, that there is no absolute space or absolute time, and that what counts as simultaneous or as fitting inside depends on the observer's state of motion. The ladder paradox has practical analogues in particle physics, where particles travelling at relativistic speeds appear contracted in the laboratory frame. And this contraction affects how they interact with detectors, how they traverse magnetic fields, and how their collisions are modelled. And physicists routinely account for length contraction and time dilation in analysing experiments. And the paradoxical features of relativity are not mere thought experiments, but daily realities in accelerator laboratories. Visualize the ladder streaking toward the garage, its atoms compressed along the direction of motion. The electromagnetic forces between atoms adjusted by the motion, creating a physically shorter object in the garage frame, and the garage rushing toward the ladder in the ladder frame, compressed to a narrow slit, and the ladder threading through this slit without ever being contained. And both pictures are correct, both are consistent, and the paradox dissolves once simultaneity is properly understood, once it is accepted that different observers experience different orderings of spatially separated events, and the ladder paradox remains a teaching tool, an illustration of how length contraction and relativity of simultaneity work together, how apparent contradictions in relativity are resolved by careful analysis of reference frames, and how our intuitions about space and time, trained on low-speed everyday experience, fail completely when speeds approach that of light, and the ladder passes through, contracted or not, trapped or not, depending on who you ask, depending on what frame you occupy, and the paradox endures as a reminder that space and time are not what they seem. That motion affects not just how we measure things, but what length and simultaneity mean, and that Einstein's revolution was not just about equations, but about reconceiving the very fabric of reality. The information paradox. What happens to information? When it falls into a black hole forms when a massive star collapses. Its gravity becomes so intense that nothing can escape, not even light, and the boundary beyond which escape is impossible is called the event horizon, a spherical surface surrounding the black hole, and anything that crosses this horizon is lost forever, pulled inexorably toward the central singularity where density becomes infinite, and the known laws of physics break down. And this seems straightforward. Black holes consume matter and energy. They grow as they absorb material, and information about what fell in is destroyed, erased from the universe. But this simple picture creates a profound paradox, because quantum mechanics insists that information cannot be destroyed, that the universe preserves a complete record of its state, that if you know the present perfectly, you can, in principle, reconstruct the past. And this principle of information conservation is fundamental to quantum theory, underlies the mathematics of quantum mechanics. And if information can be destroyed in black holes, then quantum mechanics is wrong, or incomplete, or requires modification. And this clash between black hole physics and quantum mechanics is the information paradox, first articulated clearly by Stephen Hawking in the 1970s, and still not fully resolved despite decades of intense research. Imagine throwing a book into a black hole. The book contains information, words on pages encoding knowledge, and as the book falls toward the event horizon, it crosses that boundary and disappears, and an observer watching from outside can never retrieve the book, can never read its contents. The information seems lost, and if millions of books are thrown in, if stars and planets and entire galaxies are consumed, all that information vanishes and the black hole carries no record of what it ate. It is characterized completely by just 3 numbers: its mass, its electric charge, and its angular momentum, and everything else. All the details, all the structure, all the information about what fell in is gone. And this erasure of information violates quantum mechanics, violates unitarity, the principle that time evolution is reversible. That information is conserved, and so we face a dilemma: either quantum mechanics fails, or general relativity fails, or our understanding of black holes is incomplete. And all 3 options are troubling. All 3 challenge the foundations of modern physics. The paradox deepens when Hawking radiation is considered, because Hawking discovered in 1974 that black holes are not completely black. They emit thermal radiation. Due to quantum effects, near the event horizon, virtual particle pairs pop into existence just outside the horizon. One particle falls in and the other escapes, and this process causes the black hole to slowly evaporate, to lose mass over time, radiating energy into space, and eventually, after an immensely long time, the black hole evaporates completely, disappearing in a final burst of radiation. And the question arises: what happens to the information that fell in? Does it emerge in the Hawking radiation, encoded somehow in the particles that escape, or is it destroyed when the black hole evaporates? And Hawking initially argued that information is lost, that the radiation is purely thermal, completely random, carrying no information about what fell in. And this conclusion shocked the physics community, contradicted quantum mechanics, and triggered a debate that has lasted decades. Visualize the black hole evaporating, slowly shrinking as it radiates, and the radiation escaping as a stream of particles, photons, and other quanta. And these particles are hot, thermal, their properties determined by the black hole's temperature, and temperature is statistical, depends only on energy, not on the details of what produced the radiation. And so the Hawking radiation seems to carry no information about the book that fell in, about the stars that were consumed, about the specific configuration of matter that formed the black hole. And if the radiation carries no information, then when the black hole evaporates completely, when the last bit of mass is radiated away and the black hole vanishes, the information is gone, erased from the universe, and quantum mechanics is violated. And this is Hawking's original conclusion: information is lost. And this creates the paradox. Many physicists rejected this conclusion, argued that information must somehow be preserved, that the radiation must carry subtle correlations, quantum entanglements that encode the information in ways that are not obvious, that appear thermal locally but contain hidden structure globally. And this view, that information is preserved, requires that the Hawking radiation is not purely thermal but contains incredibly subtle quantum correlations that encode everything that fell in. And these correlations would be fantastically complex, impossible to detect in practice, but they must exist to preserve unitarity, to maintain consistency with quantum mechanics. And this led to proposals about how information might escape, perhaps through quantum corrections to Hawking's calculation, perhaps through the interior structure of black holes being more complex than classical general relativity suggests, perhaps through the holographic principle, which says that all information in a region of space can be encoded on its boundary. And so information that falls into a black hole is actually stored on the event horizon, not lost inside, and gradually released as the black hole evaporates. The debate between information loss and information preservation became one of the most important controversies in theoretical physics, with Hawking on one side arguing for loss, and most of the quantum mechanics community on the other arguing for preservation, and the stakes were high. If information is lost, then quantum mechanics needs revision. If information is preserved, then general relativity or our understanding of black hole interiors needs revision, and either way, fundamental physics faces a crisis. And the paradox drove research in string theory, quantum gravity, holography, and black hole thermodynamics. And gradually, a consensus emerged that information is probably preserved, that Hawking radiation is not purely thermal, but carries information in subtle quantum correlations, though the details of how this works remain contentious and incomplete. Hawking eventually conceded the argument, famously changed his mind in 2004, and admitted that information is probably preserved, though he did not provide a complete mechanism, and the information paradox remains partially resolved. The community believes information is preserved, but lacks a complete detailed understanding of how information encoded in matter that falls into a black hole is transferred to the Hawking radiation that comes out. And this question touches on the deepest issues in quantum gravity, on the unification of general relativity and quantum mechanics, on the nature of space-time at the Planck scale, and on the limits of what can be known about the interior of black holes. And the paradox endures as a driving force in theoretical physics, a puzzle that has inspired new ideas, new mathematics, new ways of thinking about space and time and information. The book falls across the horizon, its pages fluttering, its words disappearing, and the black hole absorbs it, grows slightly more massive, and eventually the black hole evaporates. Hawking radiation streaming out, particles escaping, and somewhere in that radiation, encoded in correlations too subtle to detect, the information about the book survives, preserved by the laws of quantum mechanics, hidden but not destroyed. And the paradox resolves, not by destroying information, but by recognizing that black holes are more subtle than they seem, that the event horizon is not a simple boundary, but a complex quantum surface, that the interior is not a simple void, but a region where space-time and quantum mechanics intertwine in ways we are only beginning to understand. And the information paradox remains, solved in principle, but not in detail, a monument to the challenge of reconciling quantum mechanics and gravity, and a reminder that black holes, mysterious and powerful, continue to teach us about the fundamental nature of reality, about the limits of our theories, and about the deep connections between information, entropy, and the structure of space-time. The flicker of freedom, the tiny space where choice still lives. A philosopher examines Frankfurt's counterexamples, the cases where a person acts on their own but could not have done otherwise because an intervener would have prevented any alternative. And Frankfurt argues these cases show that responsibility does not require the ability to do otherwise, that alternate possibilities are not necessary for free will. But philosopher Robert Kane and others have identified something Frankfurt missed, a detail in the structure of the cases that preserves a tiny alternative, a flicker of freedom, a moment where the person could have begun to choose differently before the intervener stopped them. And this flicker, though tiny, though insufficient to constitute full alternative action, might be enough to ground responsibility, might show that Frankfurt's cases do not actually eliminate alternatives, but only limit them. And if the flicker is necessary for responsibility, then the principle of alternate possibilities survives. Survives, in modified form, requires not robust alternatives, but only minimal alternatives, only flickers. And this is the flicker of freedom argument, the observation that Frankfurt cases contain residual alternatives, tiny spaces where choice still operates. And these flickers might be necessary and sufficient for responsibility. And the debate about Frankfurt cases becomes a debate about whether flickers matter, whether tiny alternatives count, whether responsibility requires robust alternatives or only minimal ones. And this debate has generated extensive literature, has forced refinement of Frankfurt's argument, has led to increasingly complex thought experiments designed to eliminate even flickers. And the question remains whether true flicker-free cases are possible, whether alternatives can be completely eliminated while responsibility is preserved, and the flicker of freedom persists as a challenge to Frankfurt's argument, as a defense of the principle of alternate possibilities, as a last stand for the view that responsibility requires alternatives. Imagine a Frankfurt case carefully. Jones is about to decide whether to vote for candidate A or candidate B, and Black, the intervener, has placed a device in Jones's brain that monitors his neural activity, and the device can detect which way Jones will decide before Jones becomes conscious of his decision, can detect the neural precursors of choosing B, and if the device detects these precursors, it will intervene, will alter Jones's brain to make him decide to vote for A instead. But if Jones is going to decide on his own to vote for A, then the device does nothing, remains dormant, and now suppose Jones decides on his own to vote for A. The device detects no precursors of choosing B because there are none. Jones was always going to choose A on his own, and so the device does nothing, and Jones votes for A based on his own decision, and Frankfurt says Jones is responsible even though he could not have done otherwise, because if he had started to choose B, the device would have intervened, and so Jones could not have voted for B, had no alternative, and yet Frankfurt says Jones is responsible because he acted on his own and the device played no role. But now consider the flicker. There is a moment, however brief, before the device detects that Jones is choosing B, before the device can intervene, and in that moment, Jones could have begun to choose differently, could have initiated the neural precursors that would have triggered intervention, and this moment is a genuine alternative. Is something Jones could have done differently, even though if he had done it, the device would have stopped him from completing the alternative choice. And so there is an alternative. There is something Jones could have done otherwise, namely, begin to choose B. And this alternative, though tiny, though incomplete, is a flicker of freedom. And the question is whether this flicker is sufficient to ground responsibility, whether the ability to begin an alternative is enough even if the ability to complete it is absent. Visualize freedom as coming in degrees. At one end is robust freedom, the full ability to choose and complete any available alternative. At the other end is no freedom, no alternatives whatsoever. And flickers are near the no freedom end, but not quite at it. Are minimal alternatives, are the ability to begin alternatives, even if not to complete them. And the debate is whether this minimal freedom is sufficient for responsibility, whether flickers count or whether only robust alternatives matter. And source theorists who follow Frankfurt say flickers do not matter, say that what matters for responsibility is not alternatives but source, whether the action flows from the agent's own will. And flicker theorists who defend alternate possibilities say flickers do matter, say that responsibility requires some alternative, even if minimal, even if only a flicker. Frankfurt responded to the flicker objection by constructing more sophisticated cases, blockage cases, where the intervener does not wait for precursors but intervenes earlier, or cases where the intervener controls the entire deliberative process, ensures that only one alternative is genuinely possible psychologically, and these refined cases attempt to eliminate even flickers, attempt to create scenarios where no alternative exists at any point, not even the alternative of beginning to choose differently. And if such flicker-free cases are possible, if they preserve responsibility, then Frankfurt's argument succeeds, shows that responsibility does not require alternatives, and the principle of alternate possibilities is refuted. But critics argue that truly flicker-free cases are impossible, that any case detailed enough to eliminate all flickers will either eliminate responsibility along with alternatives, or will preserve subtle flickers that defenders miss. And this back and forth, this attempt to construct and critique flicker-free cases has dominated discussions of Frankfurt cases for decades, has generated increasingly technical papers, increasingly complex scenarios, and no consensus has emerged, and both sides claim victory, claim that the cases support their view, and the debate continues. The flicker of freedom also connects to debates about determinism and sourcehood, Because if determinism is true, then flickers might not exist, might themselves be eliminated by deterministic causation, and so the flicker debate might ultimately depend on whether determinism is true, whether quantum indeterminacy provides space for genuine alternatives. And this makes the debate about flickers part of the larger debate about free will and determinism, about whether compatibilism or incompatibilism is correct. One response to the flicker argument accepts that flickers exist in Frankfurt cases, but denies that flickers ground responsibility, argues that the ability to begin an alternative that would immediately be stopped is not the kind of ability that matters for responsibility, is not genuine control, is not enough to make the action truly up to the agent, and responsibility requires more than flickers, requires robust alternatives, or requires source without alternatives. And flickers are too weak to do the work that alternate possibilities theorists need them to do. And Frankfurt's argument succeeds despite the flickers, because flickers are irrelevant to responsibility. Another response embraces flickers, argues that they show Frankfurt cases fail, show that alternatives are preserved, and this response modifies the principle of alternate possibilities to say that responsibility requires alternatives, but these alternatives need not be robust, need only be flickers, need only be the ability to begin alternatives even if not to complete them. And this modified principle is immune to Frankfurt's argument because Frankfurt cases contain flickers, and flicker-free cases either do not exist or do not preserve responsibility, and so the principle of alternate possibilities survives in modified form, survives as the principle that responsibility requires. At least flickers of freedom requires some alternative possibilities, however minimal. The flicker debate also raises questions about what counts as an alternative, about how much control is required for something to be a genuine alternative, and these questions are central to understanding freedom, to specifying what free will requires, and the flicker debate, though technical, though focused on detailed cases, ultimately concerns fundamental issues about agency, control, and responsibility. And the debate has been productive, has forced clarification of concepts, has revealed complexity in notions that seemed simple, and whether flickers matter, whether they ground responsibility or are irrelevant, remains disputed, remains one of the many unresolved issues in the free will debate. Jones votes, the device does nothing, and somewhere in the process there is or is not a flicker, a moment where Jones could have begun differently, a tiny alternative that would have triggered intervention, and whether this flicker exists and whether it matters determine whether Frankfurt's argument succeeds, whether responsibility requires alternatives and the flicker of freedom remains, tiny but potentially crucial, a last gasp of alternate possibilities in cases designed to eliminate them. And the debate continues, philosophers constructing ever more sophisticated cases, critics finding ever more subtle flickers, and the question persists, do flickers matter? Are tiny alternatives enough for responsibility, or is responsibility about source not alternatives, about where choices come from, not what else could have been chosen, and the flicker flickers, at the edge of possibility, barely existing, possibly necessary, and the debate around it endures. The origination paradox, why you cannot create yourself. A philosopher asks where free will comes from. What makes a choice truly free, truly yours? And the answer seems to require that you be the ultimate source of your choices, that your decisions originate with you rather than being caused by factors beyond your control. And this origination, this ultimate sourcehood, seems necessary for responsibility, because if your choices are caused by factors you did not create, by genes you did not choose, by environments you did not design, by prior causes that reach back before your birth, then how are you responsible for those choices? How are they truly yours? And yet origination seems impossible, seems to require that you create yourself, that you choose your own character before you have a character to make choices with. And this is the origination paradox, the problem that free will seems to require ultimate origination, ultimate sourcehood, being the first cause of your actions, but such origination is impossible, requires creating yourself from nothing, requires existing before you exist to make the choices that create you. And this impossibility suggests that free will, understood as requiring ultimate origination, is impossible, is an incoherent concept, and responsibility is problematic. And this paradox has driven many philosophers to conclude that free will, in the strong libertarian sense, does not exist, cannot exist, and the most we can have is a weaker compatibilist freedom that does not require ultimate origination. Imagine trying to be the ultimate source of your actions, trying to take complete responsibility for what you do, and you trace back the causes of your action. Your action was caused by your decision. Your decision was caused by your desires and beliefs. Your desires and beliefs were caused by your experiences and your innate psychology. Your innate psychology was caused by your genes and early development. Your genes were caused by your parents, and the causal chain extends back before your existence. And at no point in this chain did you create the causes. At no point did you originate the factors that shaped you. And so you are not the ultimate source of your actions. You are a link in a causal chain that extends beyond you. And if responsibility requires ultimate origination, then you are not responsible because you did not originate yourself, did not create the character from which your choices flow. The origination paradox can be stated as an impossibility argument. To be ultimately responsible for an action, you must be ultimately responsible for how you are, for your character, your values, your psychology, because your action flows from how you are, and to be ultimately responsible for how you are. You must have chosen to be that way, but to choose to be a certain way, you must already have some character, some values, some psychology to make the choice with. And this prior character must itself have been chosen if you are to be ultimately responsible for it. And this leads to an infinite regress. You must have chosen your character. Before choosing your character, must have existed before you existed to create yourself. And this is impossible. And so ultimate responsibility, ultimate origination is impossible. And if free will requires it, then free will is impossible. Visualize the regress to be responsible for action. A, you must be responsible for character C that caused A, and to be responsible for C, you must be responsible for earlier character CE that caused C, and to be responsible for C, you must be responsible for even earlier character C, and so on infinitely. And the regress cannot be completed, cannot be grounded, because there is no first character that you chose, no original act of self-creation. And so the chain of responsibility has no beginning, hangs unsupported, and ultimate responsibility collapses. And with it collapses free will understood as requiring ultimate origination. This argument, developed by Galen Strawson and others, is meant to show that libertarian free will understood as requiring ultimate sourcehood, is impossible, is incoherent. And this drives the debate toward compatibilism, toward the view that free will does not require ultimate origination, but only requires that actions flow from the agent's own psychology, from their desires and values, even if those desires and values were themselves caused by factors beyond the agent's control. And compatibilism avoids the origination paradox by weakening the requirements for freedom, by denying that ultimate origination is necessary. One response to the origination paradox accepts it, accepts that ultimate responsibility is impossible, and embraces the conclusion that no one is truly responsible in the ultimate sense. And this view, sometimes called hard incompatibilism, denies both that we have libertarian free will and that compatibilist freedom is sufficient for genuine responsibility. And moral responsibility is an illusion, is a concept that cannot be sustained once we recognize the impossibility of ultimate origination, and we should replace responsibility with other concepts. with forward-looking considerations about consequences and prevention rather than backward-looking considerations about desert and blame. Another response argues that ultimate origination is not necessary for responsibility. That responsibility requires only proximate origination, being the proximate cause of action, the immediate source. And as long as your action flows from your own deliberation, your own character, you are responsible, even if your character was shaped by prior causes, even if you are not the ultimate source. And proximate origination is sufficient for the kind of responsibility that matters for ethics and law. And the origination paradox shows only that ultimate responsibility is impossible, not that ordinary responsibility is impossible, and we should not let the impossible standard of ultimate origination undermine the possible standard of proximate origination. A third response from agent causation theories argues that persons are uncaused causes, are agents who can initiate causal chains without being caused to initiate them. And agent causation is a special kind of causation, different from event causation, where events cause events and agents, as substances have the power to cause events without being caused to exercise that power. And this avoids the regress because the agent does not need to cause themselves, does not need prior character to act, but can act directly as an uncaused cause. And this preserves ultimate origination by making agents first causes. But critics argue that agent causation is mysterious, unexplained, involves a kind of causation that seems inconsistent with naturalism, seems like magic, and the theory creates more problems than it solves. The origination paradox also connects to debates about moral luck, about whether we can be responsible for factors beyond our control, because the paradox shows that if we trace back far enough, everything is beyond our control, everything is luck, is the product of factors we did not choose, and if we cannot be responsible for luck, then we cannot be responsible for anything. And this conclusion, while following from the paradox, seems too extreme, seems to eliminate responsibility entirely, and this drives some philosophers to accept moral luck, to accept that we can be responsible for actions that depend on factors beyond our control. That responsibility does not require eliminating luck, but only requires certain kinds of control, certain kinds of connection between agent and action. The philosopher asks where you came from, how you became the person you are, and the answer traces back through causes, through genes and upbringing and choices and experiences. And none of these origins were ultimately under your control. None were self-created, and so you are not self-caused, are not self-created, are not the ultimate origination of yourself. And if responsibility requires self-creation, then you are not responsible, and the origination paradox stands as a permanent challenge to libertarian theories of free will, shows that ultimate origination is impossible, shows that we cannot be the uncaused first causes of ourselves, and whether this impossibility undermines all responsibility or only ultimate responsibility remains contested, and the paradox persists, a challenge to the idea that we are truly the authors of our actions, truly the originators of our choices, and the causal chain extends back, and you stand in the middle, caused by the past, causing the future, and where you came from. Who created you? The answer is no one. You emerged from causes, were shaped by forces, and the origination was not yours, was nature's, was the universe's, and whether this makes you unfree, makes responsibility impossible, remains one of the deepest questions in philosophy of free will, and the origination paradox endures, impossible to solve, impossible to escape, a permanent reminder that self-creation is impossible, and ultimate origination is a fantasy, and what we are left with is proximate origination, being the immediate cause of actions, being the link through which causes flow, and whether this is enough for freedom remains the central question, and the paradox stands stark and unavoidable, showing that we did not create ourselves, cannot create ourselves, and yet must live and choose and be responsible somehow. The paradox of fiction. Why we cry for people who don't exist. A person sits in a dark theatre watching a film, and on the screen a character faces tragedy, loses a loved one, experiences betrayal, suffers deeply, and the person watching feels genuine emotion, feels sadness, feels tears forming, feels the physiological responses of grief, and yet the person knows that what is happening on screen is not real, knows that the characters are fictional, that no one actually died, that the suffering is pretend, is mere actors following a script in front of cameras. And this creates a puzzle because emotions seem to require beliefs, seem to depend on thinking that something is really happening, that genuine harm or loss has occurred. And if you do not believe something is real, then you should not have emotional responses to it. And yet, fiction produces powerful emotions, despite the audience knowing it is fiction. And this is the paradox of fiction, articulated by Colin Radford and others. The question of how we can be moved by what we know to be false, how we can fear for characters we know do not exist, how we can grieve losses we know never happened. And the paradox challenges our understanding of emotion, raises questions about the relationship between belief and feeling, and forces recognition that emotional responses are more complex than simple belief response models suggest. Imagine watching a horror film, a scene where the protagonist is chased by a monster, and your heart races, adrenaline surges, you feel fear, genuine fear, and yet you know you are safe. Know you are sitting in a theatre, know that no monster exists, that the events on screen are fabricated, and if fear requires believing you are in danger, then you should not feel fear, should remain calm, should watch with detachment, but you do not. You respond emotionally, despite knowing the fiction is not real, and this emotional engagement is not a mistake, not a failure of rationality, but is how fiction works, how stories affect us. And the paradox asks how this is possible, how belief and emotion relate when they seem to come apart in cases of fiction. The paradox can be formulated as three inconsistent claims. First, we have emotional responses to fictional characters and events. We cry at sad movies, laugh at comedies, feel suspense in thrillers, and this is undeniable. Second, emotional responses require beliefs about the reality of their objects. You cannot fear something you know does not threaten you, cannot grieve something you know did not happen. Emotions are directed at states of affairs we believe obtain. And third, we do not believe fictional characters and events are real. We know they are fictional, know that no one is actually in danger, that no loss actually occurred. And these three claims are inconsistent. Any two imply the negation of the third, and resolving the paradox requires rejecting or modifying one of them. Visualize the emotional response as a two-stage process. First comes the perception or imagination of a situation, seeing the character in danger, imagining their suffering, and second comes the emotion, the fear or sadness or joy. And normally these two stages are connected through belief. You perceive danger and believe it is real, and this causes fear. But in fiction, the connection is different. You perceive or imagine danger, but do not believe it is real, and yet fear occurs anyway. And the paradox asks what mediates the connection in fiction, if not belief. One response denies the second claim, argues that emotions do not require beliefs, that emotional responses can be triggered by perceptions or imaginings without requiring that we believe what we perceive or imagine is real, and this response treats emotions as more primitive than beliefs, as responses that evolved to deal with immediate situations and that can be activated by representations even when we know those representations are not real. And fiction works by hijacking these emotional systems, by presenting stimuli that trigger emotional responses directly without requiring belief. And so we fear fictional monsters, because our fear system responds to the representation of danger even when we know the danger is fictional. Another response modifies the first claim, argues that the emotions we feel toward fiction are not genuine emotions, but quasi-emotions, pale imitations of real emotions that lack certain components. And when we cry at a movie, we are not really sad, not in the way we would be sad if the events were real, but we are experiencing something similar, a simulation or shadow of sadness. And this quasi-emotion does not require belief because it is not the full genuine article, and this response preserves the connection between belief and genuine emotion while explaining fiction through a different kind of response that resembles emotion without being emotion. A third response, associated with Kendall Walton, appeals to imaginative engagement, argues that when we engage with fiction, we make believe. We imagine that the fictional events are real, and our emotional responses are responses to what we imagine rather than to what we believe. And imagination can trigger emotional responses without requiring belief, can produce fear and sadness and joy through imagined scenarios. And fiction invites us to imagine certain things, and our emotions follow from these imaginings. And this response treats make-believe as a distinct cognitive mode, different from both belief and mere perception. A mode that can generate emotions without requiring that we believe the imagined content is real. The paradox also raises questions about the function of fiction, about why we engage with fictional narratives, why we subject ourselves to emotions triggered by events we know are not real. And various answers have been proposed. Perhaps fiction allows us to explore possibilities, to experience situations vicariously, to rehearse emotional responses in safe contexts. Perhaps it serves social functions, helps us understand others, builds empathy, creates shared experiences, or perhaps it provides aesthetic pleasure, the enjoyment of well-crafted narratives, regardless of their truth. And understanding why fiction moves us might help explain how it moves us, might reveal the mechanisms that connect fictional representations to emotional responses. The paradox extends beyond fiction to other representational arts, to paintings that depict scenes that never occurred, to music that evokes emotions without representing anything, to imaginative scenarios we generate ourselves when daydreaming or planning. And in all these cases, emotions arise without corresponding beliefs about reality. And this suggests that the relationship between emotion and belief is more flexible than the paradox assumes, that emotions can be triggered in multiple ways, through beliefs about reality, but also through perceptions, imaginings, representations, and stimuli that engage our emotional systems directly. Some philosophers argue that the paradox reveals important truths about the nature of emotion, that emotions are not simply cognitive responses to believed states of affairs, but are complex phenomena involving perception, imagination, physiological arousal, and behavioral dispositions. And these components can dissociate, can come apart, and in fiction, we have the perceptual and imaginative components without the belief component, and this dissociation produces emotional responses that are real but not fully equivalent to emotions directed at reality. And so the paradox is not a problem to solve, but a feature to explain, a demonstration of the complexity of emotional life. The theatre darkens, the film plays, the character suffers, and the audience cries, knowing it is fiction, yet moved nonetheless. And the paradox remains a puzzle about how art affects us, how representation produces emotion, how we can care about what we know does not exist, and the tears are real even though their object is not. And this strange combination, this ability to be moved by acknowledged fiction, is central to human experience, is what makes stories powerful, makes art meaningful, makes imagination a source of feeling as potent as reality. And the paradox endures, unresolved in the sense that no consensus solution has emerged. No account of emotion and fiction that satisfies all philosophers, only a recognition that fiction moves us, that we respond emotionally to representations, that imagination and emotion are deeply connected, and that the relationship between belief and feeling is more complex than we thought. And the paradox persists as a reminder that human psychology is subtle, that cognitive and emotional systems interact in non-obvious ways, and that the ability to be moved by fiction, far from being a problem or a mistake, is a capacity that enriches life, that allows us to experience more than our immediate circumstances, to feel for others, to explore possibilities, and to find meaning in stories we know are not true. The paradox of the court when a student's promise becomes impossible to keep. An ancient story tells of a law teacher named Protagoras and his student Euathlus, and they make an agreement. The student is too poor to pay tuition up front, and so they agree that the student will pay the teacher after winning his first court case, and the teacher provides instruction, teaches the student rhetoric and law and argumentation, and the student completes his training, becomes skilled in legal reasoning, but then the student never takes a case, never appears in court, never wins anything, and years pass and the teacher has not been paid, and finally the teacher sues the student, takes him to court to demand payment. And now the paradox emerges because the case creates a logical impossibility, a situation where no judgment can be coherent, where the law contradicts itself. And this is the paradox of the court, also called Protagoras' paradox, a puzzle about legal reasoning, contracts, and self-reference that has no satisfactory solution. Imagine the trial. The teacher presents his case, arguing first that if he wins the lawsuit, then the court will order the student to pay, and the student will be legally obligated to pay the agreed tuition, and second, that if he loses the lawsuit, then the student has won his first case, and according to the original agreement, the student must pay after winning his first case, and so, either way, the student must pay, whether the court rules for the teacher or for the student. The contract ensures payment, and this argument seems impeccable, seems to show that the student cannot avoid payment, that filing the lawsuit was a clever move, that forces the student into a position where any outcome requires payment. But now the student, trained in rhetoric by the teacher himself, presents a counter-argument of equal force, arguing first that if he wins the lawsuit, then the court will rule in his favour, and he will not be legally obligated to pay, and second, that if he loses the lawsuit, then he has not won his first case, and according to the original agreement, he only pays after winning his first case, and so either way, he does not have to pay. Whether the court rules for him or against him, the contract protects him from payment, and this argument also seems impeccable, seems to show that the student cannot be forced to pay, that the lawsuit was a mistake that creates a situation where no outcome requires payment. Visualize the judge sitting in court, listening to both arguments, recognizing that both are logically valid, both follow from the premises, both reach opposite conclusions, and the judge must render a verdict, must decide whether the student pays or does not pay. But any decision seems arbitrary, seems to violate logic, because if the judge rules for the teacher, then the student wins his first case and does not have to pay, according to the contract. And if the judge rules for the student, then the student loses and does have to pay, according to the contract. And so, the judge's decision determines the opposite of what it declares, creates a self-contradicting outcome, and the law becomes incoherent, and the case cannot be decided without paradox. The paradox reveals a problem with self-referential contracts, contracts whose terms depend on the outcome of litigation about those very terms, because such contracts create loops, create situations where the contract's fulfillment depends on whether the contract is enforced, and whether it is enforced depends on whether it is fulfilled. And this circular dependency generates contradictions, makes it impossible to apply the law consistently, and the paradox shows that some contracts, even if agreed to voluntarily by competent parties, are legally unenforceable, not because they violate public policy or lack consideration, but because they are logically incoherent, because no court can implement them without contradiction. One proposed resolution is to distinguish between two different questions: the question of whether the student owes the teacher money according to the contract, and the question of whether the court should order the student to pay, and these are separate issues. The contract might create an obligation that the court nonetheless refuses to enforce. and the court could rule in favour of the student on the narrow question of whether the lawsuit succeeds, while still recognising that the student has a moral obligation under the contract to pay once he wins his first case elsewhere. And this resolution separates legal enforcement from contractual obligation, allows both arguments to be partially correct. The teacher is right that the student owes money, the student is right that the court should not order payment, and the paradox dissolves because the two contradictory outcomes apply to different questions. Another resolution appeals to temporal priority, arguing that the lawsuit itself does not count as the student's first case for purposes of the contract, because the contract was made before the lawsuit, and counting the lawsuit as the first case would mean the contract refers to itself, which creates the paradox. And so the court should interpret the contract as referring to the first case other than the lawsuit about the contract itself. And under this interpretation, if the teacher wins the lawsuit, the student must pay, because the lawsuit is not the first case that triggers payment. And if the student wins the lawsuit, the student does not pay, because the student still has not won a first case other than this one. And the paradox is resolved by excluding self-referential applications of the contract terms. A third resolution argues that the contract is void because it is impossible to perform, because there is no possible world where the terms are satisfied without contradiction, and impossible contracts are unenforceable, and so the judge should declare the contract void and dismiss the case, leaving the student with no legal obligation, but perhaps a moral obligation to pay the teacher for services rendered. And this resolution sacrifices the contract to preserve logical coherence, treats the paradox as showing that the agreement was fatally flawed from the beginning. The paradox also raises questions about the limits of freedom of contract, about whether parties should be allowed to make any agreement they choose, or whether law should refuse to enforce agreements that are logically incoherent. And most legal systems recognize some limits, refuse to enforce contracts that are impossible, illegal, or against public policy, and the paradox of the court suggests adding logical coherence as another limit, another requirement for enforceability. And this means that contracting parties cannot create obligations that are self-referentially paradoxical, cannot make agreements whose terms depend on their own enforcement in ways that generate contradictions. The paradox has modern analogues in cases involving conditional gifts and trusts, where someone leaves property to another person on condition that the recipient perform some act. And if the act is defined in terms of legal outcomes about the gift itself, then paradoxes can arise, similar to the ancient case of the teacher and student, and courts have developed various doctrines to handle these cases, generally interpreting conditions to avoid self-reference, to prevent the kind of logical loops that the paradox of the court exemplifies. The courtroom stands empty, the ancient case unresolved, the judge unable to render coherent judgment, and the paradox remains a teaching tool in logic and law, an illustration of how self-reference creates problems, how circular definitions generate contradictions, and how even voluntary agreements between competent parties can be unenforceable if their structure is logically incoherent. And Protagoras and Euathlus remain frozen in their dispute, both right and both wrong, both entitled to payment and entitled to refuse payment. And the paradox persists as a reminder that logic constrains law, that not everything that can be agreed to can be enforced, and that self-reference, whether in contracts or in statements or in rules, is a source of paradox that must be handled carefully to avoid contradiction.